So I'm Nellie Oliensis. I'm a professor in the Department of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies, and it's a huge, huge pleasure to welcome Emily Gowers back to Berkeley. Emily was our Sather professor in spring 22, and she gave a dazzling series of lectures called The Small Stuff of Roman Antiquity. People are still talking about these lectures, today. The hallmark of Emily's scholarship is her combination of an exceptionally refined and incisive literary intelligence with wide and deep knowledge of classical and post-classical literature, art, and culture. The result is some of the most revelatory work in the field. I'm not going to go through her honors. I should mention where she is now. She's professor of Latin literature, fellow of St. John's College at Cambridge, and also currently chair of the Faculty Board of Classics. I think she's maybe happy to be here as opposed to being there in that role right now. So I won't go through the whole list, and I'm not going to list all her really amazing publications, which include several books, as well as several books worth of articles on, for example, Horace's satires and on various issues related to trees. But I can't refrain from mentioning that she has two new books out over the past 2 years. One of them, which came out in early 24, is called Rome's Patron, The Lives and Afterlives of Maecenas from Princeton University Press, a long anticipated study. And I have to say, the title suggests the scope of that project, but it gives you no sense of the kind of texture and originality of the readings, which again is one of the fundamental things about her work. And then also, I'm happy to say that her Sather lectures, as I just discovered, are already out as of January 2025 under the same title as the original lecture, The Small Stuff of Roman Antiquity. In any case, I don't want to take your time or take you away from this lecture, but her lecture today, as you can see, is entitled Various Trees. Please join me in welcoming Emily Gowers.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Nellie, for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me back to Berkeley. I'm very happy to be here, as Nellie said, and seeing so many old friends and young friends as well, particularly some of my former students here. I remember very fondly my visit here in the spring of 2022. It was the twilight period towards the end of COVID-19, the time of the Omicron variant. Masks were still being worn in the streets and certainly in the classroom as well. And if you remember, you kindly gave me the option to postpone for a year, but it was my children, bless them, who urged me just to get on with it. And so emerged the Small Stuff lectures to which Nellie has just referred, which are basically a set of modest forays into some of the smallest and most trivial things that shouldn't have mattered to the Romans or taken up their imaginative space or time, but somehow managed to do so anyway. I've had, of course, all kinds of afterthoughts connected with that project, but I'm not going to talk about those today. Instead, I'll be talking about another of my old enthusiasms, which is trees. Trees are only tangentially connected to the 2022 theme, but as you'll see, they do sometimes loop back to it in a serendipitous way. I've been told by at least one person that my title is rather inadequate, but it does the double job of telling you what I'm talking about today, which is about various trees, but also about the variety of trees. So I get going. That trees have an identity, singular and often idiosyncratic, sometimes to the point of obstinacy. Oops, oh, don't mean to do that, sorry. Let's go back again. If we endow them as we tend to with human characteristics, seems to be written into our perception of them. My small garden in Cambridge, England, is overshadowed by an enormous ash tree. It must have grown before my time from a runaway seedling, and now it towers against the back fence, sucking everything out of the already dry soil. few years ago, I was assured that a deadly ash disease would sweep in from Europe and conveniently finish it off. But this guilt-free solution passed me by. Most English ashes withstood the foreign plague, leaving me with a far less palatable option: to order its destruction myself. In my neighbourhood, a so-called conservation area, you need special permission for such a killing. But as a classicist, I had a further inhibition: the spectre of all those ancient tales about what awaits humans who cut down special trees, usually insatiable hunger or overreaching lust for power, followed by a nasty end. Some people here will remember the Berkeley oak grove controversy of, I think, 2008. Well, Britons were horrified to wake up in September 2023 to find that their beloved Sycamore Gap tree, a picturesque and venerable landmark near Hadrian's Wall, had been chopped down by vandals during the night. Its special status was confirmed by a public outpouring of grief and some peculiarly humanoid language used to describe the investigation that followed. Kevin Reynolds, director of Robin Hood, Prince of Thebes, in which the tree plays a starring role, spoke of its murder, while one police officer marvelled, "In 31 years of forensics, I've never examined a tree." You'll be pleased to hear that the stump has since put out 6 new saplings, while my stubborn ash tree, for now at least, stands its ground. The similarities and standoffs between trees and humans have fascinated me for many years now, especially those in Virgil and Ovid. But today I'll be speaking about a well-known example from Roman material culture, and it has several Berkeley associations. A smaller first draft of this lecture was dedicated to William Fitzgerald, long of this department, and of course a wonderful writer on the aesthetics of variety, when he retired from King's College London. But its first seeds were sown a year ago here in a swimming pool near Strawberry Creek Park. Back in spring 2022, poet John Shobtor, I'm pleased to see here, had taken me to Great Stone Face Park to see the ancient oaks there, which have almost turned into stone, so mimetically have they glued themselves into cavities in the rhyolite lava deposits left over from the primordial soup. Invisible, but no less on my mind at that time, were the infinite collaborative networks that run around the tree's roots. The book I bought for the flight out here in 2022 was Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, all about fungi, those ubiquitous, surreptitious creatures, some of which are said to be clever enough to find their way out of a ground plan of IKEA faster than any human can. To me, they symbolize the uncanny ways in which everything I've read since seems to be interconnected. What I want to think about today is the question of tree identity. Are trees singular or collective? Are they trees or wood, or can you see both at the same time? Where Latin literature goes, there's no shortage of singular trees. The second of those Sather lectures featured one such, the bendy ilex mentioned by Sallust in his Jugurtha, a lone outcrop in an arid North African landscape. It's a Ligurian auxiliary soldier who chances on it while looking for water, led to it by a trail of insignificant seeming snails. I can't show you pictures of the trees or the snails here, as I don't think they've ever been represented in art. Instead, on the left, you have a late specimen of the lone tree and sunset motif, identified by Lev Yarrow as a long-standing symbol of colonized Africa. And on the right, you have my photo of a rather suggestive Roman column base that I stumbled on by chance at Volubilis in Morocco. That's certainly a palm tree in the middle, but who knows whether those spirals are depictions of local snails. When he climbs the tree, the soldier gets a different perspective on a military impasse, one that will indirectly divert the course of Roman history. There's something very special about the tree that he mentions, a twisted home oak that Sallust seems to relish. The words ilex inflexa, bendy ilex, roll off his tongue. Enough at any rate to capture at a surprisingly leisurely pace what Gerard Manley Hopkins would one day call the tree's inscape. In this case, the uniquely jerky shape that travels first along and then up and then along again, a shape that is realistically caused by the stresses of drought or desert wind. But if it's stunted and distorted according to standard aesthetic norms, the tree's queer shape at least provides an opportune perch for this human explorer. His curiosity leads to productive lateral thinking, in this case spying on the enemy camp from behind, which is reflected in both the tree's warped shape and the snail's random trail. Another singular tree, a plane, as students here will know, hangs over a rich man's lake in Statius's poem Sylvae 2:3. It seems to take a deep dive into it and then rise again like Excalibur from the water's depths. Statius spins a fanciful tale of how the tree used to be a nymph, driven into the water to escape the grasp of a lustful Pan, who once thwarted graciously dedicated a tree to droop over the waters until the nymph should welcome it into her depths. There stands a tree shading the limpid waters of elegant Melior, that's the owner, embracing a pool. Starting from the base of the trunk, it bends into the pond and thence returns aloft, its top erect as though born anew from the midst of the waves and dwelling with hidden roots in the glassy stream. That glassy stream, in Shackleton Bailey's translation, draws a line to another tragic sight marked by another bent tree in Gertrude's speech in Hamlet about Ophelia's drowning. There is a willow grows aslant a brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. Both poets, Statius and Shakespeare, endow natural things with sentience, superimposing plant and human emotions. Shakespeare animates the twig that snapped out of envy, causing Ophelia's fall, and describes the brook as weeping on receiving her. Statius's Pan, meanwhile, berates the pond as envious or mean inwider, and the tree as embracing the water. And while Statius borrows the god's capacity to animate the plane tree, making it into a kind of hybrid tree-water nymph itself, Shakespeare plays on the indiscriminate drowning of Ophelia along with all her trimmings, clothes and garlands, weeds in two senses of the word, as she merges into her natural element. There on the pendant boughs, her coronet weeds clambering to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook. Statius also has another story to tell about humans and trees. This garden, as I said, belongs to Attidius Melior, and the better in Melior's name sparks a reference to the reburgeoning fortunes of another Roman family and its latest scion, Melior's friend Blysus, who it's promised will grow green again, put out new leaves, revirescet. The metaphors of vicissitude and regreening have already been suggested by the ups and downs of the plane tree's undulating shape. All this contrasts with another singular tree, Tacitus's characteristically ironic ruminal fig tree at the end of Annals 13, which chooses to burst into new growth just as the Julio-Claudians are irrevocably going downhill. In novos fetus re vivesceret. And trees and family fortunes are connected in another poem, Horace Odes 112, which compares the reputation of the Berkeley, resurfacing from a period of obscurity to marry into the imperial house, to the submerged roots of a tree that grows in the hidden lapse of time. Crescat occultu velut arbor aevo farma Berkeley. As Eleanor Giusti puts it, this is an entangled family tree whose roots grow imperceptibly beneath the earth, with ramifications that lie well beyond the poet's control. Each of these trees is celebrated for its uniqueness and its deviancy, its permanence and its impermanence at once. And let's not forget another immortal ilex, the one that balances forever in the hollows of rocks in Horace's ode to the Fons Bandusiae. More commonly, though, the singular quirkiness of individual trees is squeezed out by the collective features of the forest. And it's that tension between the two that I want to focus on today. A year ago, as I said, I found myself ploughing up and down a Berkeley swimming pool with my friend Anne Arnold, when I happened to mention the trees on Trajan's column. I'd started noticing them when I was choosing images from the column to illustrate military formations in that small stuff book. Anne, who I'm delighted to see here, who's an artist, she illustrated Fanny at Chez Panisse, and she's a gifted still life painter, immediately mentioned art historian Lothar Letterose's The 10,000 Things, which is here, Module and Mass Production in Chinese Art, a book from 1999 about China's invention of and respect for mass-produced art. Letterose explains a crucial difference between Western and Chinese thought in this respect. While Westerners believe that art gets its heightened status from being divorced from reproduction, from being unique, artisanal, and original, Walter Benjamin, for example, thought art loses its aura if reproduced mechanically. Chinese artists have always seen mass production as positively creative and abundant. Humans imitating nature's limitless reproductive skill, and if it's done by hand, whether it's noodle making or calligraphy, still open to all kinds of minute variations. Lederer's title, The 10,000 Things, celebrates the potential that Chinese culture recognizes for achieving multifariousness within plurality. The 10,000 things are produced and reproduced so that variation and transformation have no end. Or elsewhere he writes, the Chinese trust that as in nature, there will always be some among the 10,000 things from which change springs. Trees, as prime specimens of natural reproduction, often show up in Ledrose's book as points of comparison. He writes, for example, the 10,000 leaves of a mighty oak all look similar, but exact comparison will reveal that no two of them are completely identical. But when he compares calligraphic characters on this ancient Buddhist sutra with leaves on a tree, he finds differences as well as similarities. In the inscription, no two characters are the same. They aren't mechanical, they're carved by hand, which makes them as endlessly varied as individual leaves. This is how writing transcends techne to become art with a capital A. Even so, there are limits on the calligrapher's freedom. You couldn't change a single letter in the written sequence without the text becoming less intelligible. Leaves, on the other hand, seem to grow randomly. That seem I'll come back to later. If one fell off, you wouldn't exactly miss it. 18th century Chinese calligrapher Zheng Xie, who produced infinitely different images of plant growth within a set formula, and you can see some in the background on the left, once declared, I have 10,000 bamboo stalks in my mind which burst forth at any moment as dripping wet ink. And so it was that I got interested in the idea of variety within mass production as a characteristic of both trees and their representation. 15 years before him, another writer reversed Ledrose's analogy by comparing trees to Chinese characters. This is what he writes. More problematic is classifying the trees, which are represented in a simplified form, almost as ideograms, but still capable of being grouped into a restricted number of clearly distinct species. There's one kind of tree with oval leaves, and another with wispy leaves. Then there are oaks with their distinctive foliage. I think I can recognize a fig tree as well, sticking out from a wall. Trees constitute the most frequently recurring landscape element. Well, this is Italo Calvino, and he's talking about the marble trees on Trajan's column, which he had the chance to view under exceptional circumstances when he climbed the scaffolding with archaeologist Salvatore Settis during repairs to the column in the 1980s, as he records in the short essay that Penguin have recently reproduced in a tiny collection called The Narrative of Trajan's Column. On further reflection, it's not that surprising, either that Calvino made the ascent or that he noticed the trees. The son of two botanists, born among the exotic fruit and flora of Cuba, he was later acclimatized, along with their other tropical specimens, in his parents' plant laboratory back in San Remo, in Liguria, Italy. Calvino's knowledge of trees was extensive, and you can see it on display above all in his novel Il Barone Rampante, The Baron in the Trees, from 1957. It tells the story of a boy called Cosimo, around the time of Napoleon's drastic deforestation of Liguria, who rebels against aristocratic convention by taking up residence for the rest of his life in the branches of his parents' arboretum, where he fathers many children and becomes a kind of Enlightenment philosopher. But it all begins with a nasty scene at the family dinner table. After refusing to eat some snails that his mean sister, the nun Battista, has cooked and served up to the family, Cosimo rushes outside and climbs the nearest tree, a tree that just happens to be an ilex, leccio in Italian. And when I reread that scene last year, I suddenly realized that Calvino, who was, I gather, known as a spokesman for Ligurian local identity and the tough and skinny constitutions of his countrymen, had clearly been introduced, probably in Latin lessons at his Liceo Classico, to another Ligurian, Sallust's rugged climber. So this is the moment of serendipity I was talking about earlier, and I got there just in time to get it into the small stuff book. If you look at Calvino's language, you can see how it even echoes Sallust's description of the Ligurian's bold curiosity, what Sallust calls his desire to do difficult things, difficilia faciundi, because when Cosimo's brother recalls the motives behind their boyhood tree climbing, he says they weren't so much driven by thoughts of prey, collecting birds' eggs and so on, as by the transcendent pleasure of overcoming difficult protuberances and forks and getting as high up as possible. Okay, now to Trajan's column. Arithmetic holds sway in most accounts of this marvellous structure. After all, facts and figures matter for getting your head around its miraculous and head-spinning combination of two of antiquity's favourite rhetorical opposites, megathos, grandeur, on the one hand, and akrabeia, precision, on the other. And all this has been compellingly discussed by Francesco de Angelis. Just to rehearse a few basic statistics, the column, 38 metres high, including its base, dedicated in 115 CE, delivers a narrative of Trajan's two Dacian wars in 155 scenes, perhaps originally painted in colour, in any case a visual equivalent to written histories, including Trajan's own. Many scholars like to interpret it as a giant book scroll, a volumen, and thus a counterpart to written accounts, Wolwere also being the standard term for the unfurling of the annals of history. The column's shaft is wrapped around by 200 meters of content, most of it impossible to appreciate from the ground, but vouched for by any barone rampante who gets to indulge in the superhuman vision assumed by its first makers, or who climbs the spiral staircase inside, which, as it happens, was called from ancient times a cochlea, or snail. The unbroken ribbon of narrative encourages us to read around, along, and upwards, but much has also been made of the way that scenes that end up on top of each other speak to each other and even function as a kind of summary of the rest. There's a wider pedestal at the base and a space at the top, occupied variously through history by a statue of the emperor, a real-life owl, and now a figure of St. Peter. From this point on, I make grateful use of Roger Ulrich of Dartmouth College's amazing website, trajanscolumn.org, and John Coulston's St. Andrew's Trajan's Column project, both of which reproduce casts of the column's frieze from the Museo della Civiltà Romana in Rome. And there's also Frank Lepper and Shepard Freer's learned but very engaging commentary. We start with the human antagonists. They are themselves marvelously varied, meticulously marked out by their hairstyles and costumes, from various ranks of the Roman army to shaggy Dacians, and even Sarmatian warriors in kaftans or fish-scale bodysuits. But there's been almost as much interest in the landscapes they occupy: fortifications, towns, riverbanks, and woods, all inscribed with as much detail as the human figures. The commonest interpretation of the column's 224 trees is that they function as realistic topographical background, and more specifically as scene dividers. There they stand, punctuating episodes as convenient vertical barriers in the narrative's onward linear progress. But once you make them focus rather than background, they too turn out to be extraordinarily varied. Oval, wispy, maybe a fig tree, Calvino's impressionistic responses wouldn't have cut it for Romanian forestry expert Cristian Stoiculescu. And Romanian scholars loom large in Trajanic art history, given that Dacia is now Romania, and modern Romanians can claim both sides in the ancient wars as their ancestors. In 1985, Stoiculescu painstakingly identified and catalogued the trees, first into deciduous versus resinous, then into 6 subgroups of deciduous trees, and came up with a total of no fewer than 37 leaf types. He concluded that all but 2 of the trees are native to Dacia, proof of the sculptor's attention to detail and geographical accuracy, though he admits that trees are schematically represented and a single tree can be code for a whole forest. There's one oddity: the common beech tree, Fagus, appears only once, in scene 27, where Trajan's addressing his troops, whereas oaks appear frequently and have been taken as archetypally Dacian for the purposes of the column, despite being widespread across the whole of Europe. So Dacia's shorthand is its woody landscape, whose very darkness apparently spooked the Roman army that arrived there in 75 BCE. After all, a large part of it would become modern Transylvania. The Dacians are even said to have brought a message to Trajan inscribed on a giant mushroom. In his recent article, Trajan's Trees, Andrew Fox, now also author of the 2023 book Trees in Ancient Rome, brings out a further imperialist dimension. He argues convincingly that the column aligns trees and Dacians as joint victims of Rome. This is a conquest not just of Dacia's suicidal king, Decebalus, but also of its landscape. After all, a repeated motif shows Romans chopping down the thick woods where their enemies lurk. You get 1/5 of the trees appearing in such scenes, and then replacing them with clearings, or civilized settlements. As Andrew Fox stresses, actual trees were often paraded in Roman triumphs along with the human losers. And evidently no shame for the Romans redounded from these whole-scale incursions into nature. In fact, a contemporary inscription, the Tabula Trajana, survives near the Danube in modern Serbia. It extols Trajan for building a new road by cutting through mountains and placing brackets or crossbeams underneath. The protagonists, too, fit well into this scheme. Civilized Trajan is largely shown as an urban king, savage Decebalus as a forest king, isolated, camouflaged, even protected by trees in many of his appearances. And of course, the tree cutting also serves as a commentary on the mass operations of the column sculptors. Calvino puts it nicely in his essay. The Roman advance opens up a path in the primeval forest, just as a sculpted story opens up a passage in the block of marble. So what I'd like to do now is to suggest a few more ways in which the original artists have drawn attention to analogies between humans, trees, and architecture on the column, from the blindingly obvious to the more contentious. It's not just, I think, that the trees function as ideograms for the botanical variety of ancient Dacia, or as counterparts to human conquest. There's also a sensitivity on the part of the sculptors to relationships between all three, even to the point of what you might call punning. A very literal version of this has been argued for in scene 3, where Leper and Freya suggests that the two trees that you can see in the middle, in the background here, are poplars because they give a clue to the name of the town being depicted, Viminacium, poplars being good for making wickerwork, vimina. Trees and the material they supply interact with the human world from the very start. I'll hand over to Calvino again to guide us through the friez's opening moments. The narrative strip opens at first very low down, then gradually rising upwards, with a landscape of a fortified Roman town on the river, with its walls, lookout towers, and beacons in case of incursions by the Dacians. Piles of wood for fires, piles of hay for columns of smoke, all elements that are meant to create a sense of alarm, of waiting, of danger, like in a John Ford Western. This explains some, to me at least, mysterious items here. The thing that looks like a wine rack is a wood pile, and then the two pointed cones are haystacks. The little huts that come before, surrounded by fences, aren't domestic dwellings but stockaded blockhouses. All are functional military devices. Even so, there's something about the isolation of these small-scale opening motifs that makes all three, blockhouses, wood piles, and haystacks, look to me like more than just ideograms for fortified camp. In fact, if you look at the top left, we begin with nothing more than the rolling waters of the Danube, which in context looks somewhat like a representation of chaos or a primeval flood. The primitive huts almost float on it like arks. Stone-built, but small-scale and surrounded by vertical wooden stockades, they look, not by chance, like the building blocks of a narrative that will culminate in Roman victory at the top of a marble column, a word related to culminate, in the middle of the greatest urban conglomeration in the world. In general, it's been noticed the Dacians' fortifications are 50% wood-based, while the Romans tend increasingly towards stone masonry. It all reminds me of the architectural evolution condensed in Ovid's Baucis and Philemon story, where a wooden hut turns overnight into a gold temple, or Virgil's palimpsestic vision of early and later Rome using Romulus's hut in Aeneid 8, or Virgil again panning out at the end of Eclogue 1 from the smoking roofs, culmina of rustic cottages, to the longer shadows cast by the Alpine mountains. The shapes of the objects that follow the water are interesting too. The wood piles, cubes shown in perspective filled with logs, are the first of many, horizontal, orderly, and standardized, by contrast with the vertical and liberated thrust of trees elsewhere. As for the haystacks, aren't they an alternative, primitive form of wrapped cone, analogous to the column itself, but folded in the opposite direction? It's almost as if excuses are being made to include any form or stage of tree, whether in its natural state or as an affordance for the Roman war machine. When human beings start to populate this landscape, they stimulate further visual interactions with tree bodies. The shaggy hair and beards of the Dacians, for example, are sculpted with the same wavy abandon as both the waters of the Danube and the hair, or foliage, comma, hair in Latin, of their wispy wayward trees. And the second rank of Dacian nobility, according to Dio, were called comati, the ones with the long hair. Their arms, too, brachia, flail and spread like tree branches, which were also called brachia in Roman natural historical terminology. And the trees aren't just static, upright objects. They play a more mobile part in the choreography of the episodes, which we might see less in terms of physics, the way they balance or counterbalance human movement. For example, in the striking chiasmus of this scene, and more in terms of affect. Lepper and Freer have already noted their willful agency. They say the trees tend to assume a sinuous life of their own, so that even those which do seem to be indicating a scene boundary often stray across the fence, as it were, in unpruned luxuriance. Trees then seem to be cast as either opponents of or fellow feelers with human impulses. Sometimes they grow consistent with the slope of the unfolding narrative, and sometimes they shrink backwards as if mimicking defeat, as in this scene which shows King Decebalus committing suicide. As such, they function as barometers of war, or even as a kind of internal audience. They are, as Lothar Letteros might put it, the occasional elements from which change springs, or at least in which change is registered. Andrew Fox notes in particular in this scene the nice little leafy branch that sticks out to shield the dying Decebalus's head. He interprets it as a kind of internal scene divider that serves to isolate this doomed figure from the rest of the melee. But I'd like to see an added element of sympathy here, the tree offering an almost Virgilian tegmen covering a futile last-minute shelter to match the king's inadequate actual tegmen, the military cloak which is slipping from his shoulders. Similarly, in the next scene, a Dacian child about to be taken prisoner clutches a nearby tree trunk as if it were a parent's leg. More obvious is another visual pun. Decebalus slits his throat with a scimitar. I got a detail of it, yes. A scimitar identical to the instruments the Romans use in tree chopping. Andrew Fox quotes Stoiculescu's point that the deciduous trees on the column, like the one here, are, quotes, full of imperfections, fluted, pitted, and realistically covered with knots, suggesting that the lower branches have been previously removed. So could we see them as equivalent to their human equivalents, not walking, but unwalking wounded? Tacitus's description of the aftermath of the Battle of Bedriacum in Histories 2 similarly blurs tree and human identities. Not 40 days had passed since the battle, and on every side were mutilated corpses, severed limbs, trunci artus, rotting bodies of men and horses, the ground soaked with filth and gore, trees overthrown, portritis, arboribus, and crops trampled down in appalling devastation. The double meaning implied here of the word truncus noun trunk and adjective mutilated, suggests a further prompt to think of the column itself, not just in terms of a giant book scroll, but even as a tree trunk in its most denatured form, a marble and headless truncus, or a trunk in need of a head. And Lepper and Freer note the maker's decision not to foliate it at the top, as with other columns. Human heads, severed from bodies or stuck on spikes on both sides of the conflict, again punctuate the narrative, and in some cases, as here, are directly juxtaposed with tree chopping. At the very top of the column, we have Decebalus's head, rather indistinctly served up on a flat shield. And then round the other side, a matching victorious head of Dacia, or possibly Diana, blessing her Roman conquerors. These heads find their lost bodies, as it were, in the adapted logs, spikes, palisades, and tree trunks that furnish the Romans' colonial onslaught lower down. But then we find the two categories aligned in hollow fashion in the two tropaea, or trophies, in the very middle scene, 78, which reminds us that it was traditional in Roman victory to twin headless trees and headless bodies, totem poles mimicked in the almost Aztec shapes of the Roman standards. We find trees adapted for other celebratory purposes too. The magnificent figure of the Danube wears a skeleton tree in his hair. And at the bottom of the column, the messy Dacian oak forests where the indigenous population hide are ransacked for the triumphal oak wreaths which wrap up the story in a coronis or bookend at the base. And you can see the wreaths there, but above them is the torus on which the column sits, whose moulding is carved in a pattern of neatly tessellating laurel leaves. So a permanent evergreen tree at the bottom of the column, a triumphal crown for Trajan himself. Do we really need to choose between scrolls and tree trunks anyway? Filippo Corelli has suggested that the column is the counterpart of the Libri Lintei, the mythical linen books kept in the nearby Bibliotheca Ulpia, which recorded the emperor's warlike deeds. While Salvatore Settis thinks it mimics the painted linen banners which used to be wound around temple columns on festival days. The word liber, book, of course coming from liber, bark of a tree. Here's a photo of the cast of the column in London's Victoria and Albert Museum. This should say 1873. I know the 1973 might be sepia tinted for some of you here. But it shows us how the plaster tablets are moulded onto a brick core. So it gives you the chance to see the sculptures as a kind of outer coating. Texture on the column is telling too. This is, after all, 3D relief, not flat engraving. The slubbed waves of the Danube ripple and crest in a varied and tactile display of fluid dynamics, while the gnarled trees inspire in miniature the column's nubbly surface. When Virgil describes the shield of Aeneas, he brings out its 3D texture by using the verb horeo, to bristle, to feel rough, which he uses of the primitive thatch of Romulus's hut. So too, earlier in Aeneid 8, in the walk around Rome, Evander speaks of the once thickety capital as horrida, and even mentions the blood-stained brambles in the wood where Metius Furficius was or will be torn apart. Talking of linen wrappings, there's a memorable scene higher up on the column of a Roman field hospital for wounded soldiers, named by Lepper and Freer the Battle of the Bandages. And Roman bandages were usually made of linen, and you can see a nice detail on the bottom right of one being wound around the wounded soldier's leg in a pattern that we now recognize. Consciously or not, Lepper and Freer also used the same image to describe the decision to swathe the column in an imitation scroll, a parchment volumen, noting that it spirals upwards, in their words, like a fine linen bandage. Let's move now to the very top of the column, above the victory celebrations, where the frieze finally tapers to its horizontal cut-off point. And there we find, as tag end, a primeval-looking scene to match the one at the beginning. Timeless pastoral now, as herds of cattle wind slowly through a landscape dotted with ever smaller trees. As Lepper and Freer point out, if this is to be read as a post-victory scene, it's not clear whether the peaceful herdsmen are Dacians or Trajan's Roman veterans settled there as colonists. Either way, it's an image of everything going on as normal. And you can see the last element of all is a tiny, stunted tree, a modest enough miniature of Trajan's protective new force, swallowed up, as you can see here, by the larger trees encroaching from the scene below. Heads and trunks, it happens, have a long afterlife in the history of Romanian art. In 1938, Constantin Brancusi erected the so-called infinite column, Coloana Infinitului, or in French, Colonne sans fin, a 30-meter tall, 16-segment sculpture in Târgu Jiu, Romania. It's made of zinc, brass, and cast iron modules threaded onto a steel spine, durable modern alternatives to marble. But you can also see a miniature version made of oak in New York's MoMA. It was meant to represent the infinite sacrifice of Romanian soldiers in the First World War. But its endlessness was, of course, prophetic on the eve of another war. As for heads, in the 1990s, a Romanian businessman, Joseph Constantin Trajan, paid to put up a folly, his equivalent of Mount Rushmore, a monstrous head of Decebalus carved into the surface of the mountain on the Romanian side of the Danube, bang opposite the Serbian Tabula Traiana. It took 12 sculptors 10 years to finish, a monument more dignified to this Dacianist nationalist's eyes, perhaps, than the column's image of that king's head on a platter. An inscription in rough Latin proclaims Decebalus Rex Trajan Fecit. Trajan made King Decebalus, or more correctly, King Decebalus made Trajan. So history puts out more leaves. As Seneca wrote in De Clementia, enmity, like a tree, endlessly reproduces itself. Just as trees that have been trimmed throw out again countless branches, and as many kinds of plants are cut back to make them grow thicker, so the cruelty of a king by removing his enemies increases their number. Back finally to Lothar Letteros and his parallels between Chinese characters and leaves. Do trees really grow as randomly as he says they do? Scientists know far more now about just how rational and strategic trees can be. Or if that's too humanoid, at least how life-preserving in their motives. They rotate their leaves and branches for maximum exposure to light, they balance competing stresses in their core, and they compromise their growth in response to irresistible external forces. Trees have been pacemakers for human architects from the very beginning, so Vitruvius maintained, and they continue to spread their aesthetic influence on architecture today. Some of these may be familiar to you. Clockwise from the left is Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, the Grand Cistern in Istanbul, Lisbon's Orient Station, the Metropole Parasol in Seville, and Stuttgart Airport at the bottom. We have a much better understanding now of their practical genius too. The examples they set to any architect of optimized load distribution between branches and trunk, maximised energy conservation, and fractal or exponential reproduction. But trees have other lessons to teach as well. The trees on Trajan's column, whose fate is so often to be truncated, segmented, logged, or otherwise denatured, speak in their natural form of creativity, mobility, and unreplicable variety. Their leaves and branches unfurl spontaneously and even in unruly ways, which makes them the further voices, in some sense, of this epic of Roman victory. Italo Calvino ends The Baron in the Trees with a vision of his rambling narrative as akin to some kind of organic biosystem, as if glimpsed under a tree's shimmering canopy. He writes, "This thread of ink, as I've let it run for pages and pages, full of erasures, of references, of nervous blots, of stains, of gaps, that at times crumbles into large pale grains, at times thickens into tiny marks resembling dot-like seeds, now twists on itself, now forks, now links dots of sentences with edges of leaves or clouds, and then stumbles, and then resumes twisting, and runs and unrolls and wraps a large, senseless cluster of words, ideas, dreams, and is finished." On reflection, I assume Brancusi's infinite column must have been inspired by or be retaliating against Trajan's original, which shows us through its burgeoning, forking, differently positioned trees and its rolling river that narrative or history keeps going on, repetitious and infinitely varied at the same time, its selection and its endings arbitrarily imposed by the conquerors of the moment. Thank you. If there are any questions, then.
Emily, that was so lovely. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Yes, there was a beautiful eucalyptus tree at the entrance to the campus. It was cut down this summer. I don't know if you've missed it, if you've been walking around. Yeah, at the entrance. Yeah.
At the entrance, yes. I do remember where they are. Yes.
Yes,
Oh,
it
dear.
was huge.
Yes.
I mean, I presume there were many safety reasons they did, but it was during the summer, and actually I would get dropped off there with my husband in the morning to teach, and
Yes.
a lot of the wood chips would rain down, and I think some of them are still in my car, so I kind of like to think there's a little bit of
You've got a souvenir.
yes, a little bit of
those
infinity
trees.
in my car, just this very this is a not a this is more of a just a point about Trajan's column, but I just heard a presentation by a professor, Scott DeBrestian, teaches at Central Michigan University, but he actually had an assignment for students to carve a section of Trajan's column in styrofoam using 3D printing and posted it in their library,
Yes.
which has a circular opening, and to give everyone the idea of just the height of it, and where it was, but also so his students could really understand what was on the column. And it was a very elaborate project that took many tries of having this machine carving styrofoam. Unfortunately, I don't think he has pictures of it on the internet, but it was I was really just thinking about that when you pointed out all the detail, because it was very hard for the computer to capture the detail.
I was thinking, did you see it yourself, or you
I did
saw
not. I just heard him give a very good presentation just describing the project and the way it was a way of recreating the ancient world. I mean, literally recreating the ancient world. And then I thought that putting it in the library was really just kind of a really way to bring a piece of Trajan's column into Central Michigan. So yes, but my final question though is: are you going to include the Georgix book 2 in this project? Because I've just been thinking about it constantly as you've been talking.
Well, I've written about Georgix book 2 because it has an address to Maecenas in relation to the trees, and I don't talk about them very much, but I think that Maecenas as a particularly liberating kind of patron is invoked to give his blessing to Virgil for not being comprehensive in giving us all the types of trees, but allowing him to pursue his own sweet will in focusing on whichever ones he likes, which include a large ilex, I think, actually, as I saw the other day. I can't remember if it's in book 1 or in book 2. So Virgil is musing on the idea of comprehensive cataloguing, or seeing the trees in the wood individually. So that's very relevant. Yes. Yes. Thank you. I don't know if this is a project. I don't know, but I am drawn back to trees. Yes. Thank you very much. Let's see.
I've never seen
yes.
an ilex. What is
Oh.
about them? I mean, what are their qualities?
Well, I think that's a really good question. In my chapter on Sallust, for that chapter, I found out that they produce edible acorns. So they're actually a source of food. So when the Ligurian climbed on the ilex, the bendy ilex, he might, the same motives as with the snails, be wanting a snack from them. So that's one thing. They fit with the snails because they're both sources of foraging, I suppose, in the very arid landscape. Anybody else here? Ilex must be in California. It's all around the Mediterranean.
I've never heard of one here. Well, there's something they call ilex, but I'm not sure it's the same. You know what I mean? I think it.
Yes. Like the robin. Well, the eucalyptus is hardly indigenous to California, is it?
No. I have this is such an obvious question. I apologize in advance, but
Yes.
the whole thing about tree violation and so on. I mean, is there a sense? Do you feel like that the reading of all the destruction of trees here is in that vein? Do you know what I mean? Is like a Dacian
Nationalist kind of flashback.
Yeah, I just don't. I mean, I'm wondering, or is there a way of thinking of cutting down trees? That's a very good thing to do to clear spaces for things and so on. I'm just wondering if you.
Yes, I mean, I think there's the whole Richard Thomas thing of tree, of a violation of trees as a constant in Latin literature. But I think, in fact, on the column, it's a pretty good thing to do. It's the arrival of civilization, clearing spaces. The whole of Europe was forest, and that inscription suggests that Trajan used the local wood to. It's not quite clear from the Latin. The verb is sublatis, so it's not clear whether he raised up a road on wooden struts, but clearly wood was involved somehow. So as a mark of progress, I think. On the other hand, there is the tree violation tradition, so if we want to do a kind of counter-reading of the suffering of the Dacians and their native landscape on the column, that's made very possible. Yeah. Oh, Tommaso has a question. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Hi.
I guess I was really struck by your reading of the tree imagery on the column. I mean, not just the way that the trees, can comment on the scene or reflect other representational details within their frames, but that the really striking thing was how the trees seem to figure partition in so many different ways. Like, the child clinging on to the border of the scene, or the
Yes.
the severed trunks getting infinitely replicated in all of these, decapitated heads. I mean, I guess what your talk has me thinking about is how, yes, there's this like Calvino-esque idea of the tree that's constantly nodding and whirling and forming all these infinite connections, but that seems to be predicated a lot on a sense of cut or separation. I mean, it reminds me of the staceous tree as well, right? Which can only grow up after it has this like weird moment at the bottom of the pool, right? Where is it
Yes.
connected to the bottom of the pool? Does it grow? I don't know. I'm struggling to phrase this as a question, but just this, it strikes me that the tree is as much about this kind of break or cut as it is about connection, or that these two things seem really bound up in an unexpected way on the
Yeah,
column.
well, I think you put your finger on it nicely. I should say that Tommaso was one of several graduate students here who were in my class on Statius Accolade and Sylvae, and he is the only person I know to have picked out anagrams in Statius's poetry, in his depiction of the reflection of the tree in the pool. So I think you found two of them, totally original to you. So reflection is your thing, I think. Anyway, thank you, Anne. Yes.
I heard that there was going to be a dam made in the Czech Republic, and they
Yes.
funded all this, got the money together and so on. And just before they were going to start work, a beaver came in during the night and created the dam that they had been
For them.
planning for. And I just wondered,
Yes.
is there anything about beavers in
Oh.
and their relation to trees and so on that you've come
Well, there must be in Pliny. Does anybody know? Beavers in Pliny. Certainly not on the column. Actually, I don't think wildlife features very much on the column anyway. That's curious, isn't it? That's the halfway point between the humans and the trees. The cattle, of course, at the top. Yes. Hello. Oh, yeah.
Hi. Tomasi's comment made me think about gardens in particular. I think first, it might just be that cypresses are funereal, but I think Pliny writes about them being used as boundary markers of estates in terms of, I guess, maybe that particular tree serving as a boundary. But in general, I was curious, and maybe you've written about it in your book. What do you write about like the domestication of trees and gardens, or elite gardens? Because I think certain varietals that happen.
Yeah, well, thank you. Everyone seems to think that I've written a book on trees, but I haven't. A number of articles, and one article on Columella's garden poem. I haven't thought specifically about trees as boundary markers or as windbreaks, as you find them in modern agriculture. I think of rows of poplars in France, for example. Obviously, the stakes are made of wood. Quite often see Roman gardens with twisted fences, latticed fences, trellises, and so on. But that's something I don't really know about. But thank you for asking.
Thank you again, Emily. This has been a lovely and fascinating lecture. A great way to spend the
Thank you.
afternoon.